The morning sun cast long shadows across Perdition's town square as they bound Clementine Cross to the weathered oak post. Her wedding dress, once pristine white silk that had belonged to her grandmother, now bore the stains of 2 days in reverend. Pryor's cellar dirt sweat, and the rust-colored drops from her split lip, where his fist had connected when she'd refused to confess. The rope bit into her wrists as she pressed, her back against the rough bark. Around her, faces she'd known since childhood stared with a mixture of fear and righteous conviction. Mrs. Henderson, who taught her to read. Tom Garrett, whose broken leg she'd helped mend last winter. Sarah Mills, her childhood friend who now clutched her young son closer and wouldn't meet Clementine's eyes. Brothers and sisters. Reverend Judson Pryor's voice carried across the square with practiced authority. At 45, he cut an imposing figure in his black coat, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. We gather to purge the evil that has poisoned our wells and slaughtered our livestock. Clementine's throat was raw from thirst, but she found her voice. I never confessed to anything, Judson Pryor, and you know it. A murmur rippled through the crowd of nearly 60 townspeople. Pryor's pale eyes fixed on her, cold as winter ice. The devil's own words, light the kindling. As the torchbearers stepped forward, Clementine's gaze swept desperately across the faces before her. Where was Nolan? The man who'd promised to marry her, to stand by her side through anything life brought. He'd vanished the moment the accusations began, leaving her to face this nightmare alone. The dry brush caught quickly. Small flames began their hungry climb toward her feet, and she could feel the heat building against her legs. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the crowd stepped back, creating a widening circle of spectators to her execution. That's when the gunshot cracked across the square like a thunderclap. Boone Delaney stood swaying at the crowd's edge, his service revolver smoking in his trembling hand. The former cavalry sergeant looked like hell 3 days of beard, clothes that reeked of whiskey, and bloodshot eyes that had seen too much of the bottom of too many bottles since the war ended. Stop this madness. His voice, though slurred, carried the authority of a man who'd once commanded soldiers. You're about to murder an innocent woman. Pryor's face darkened. How dare you interrupt God's justice with your drunken foolishness? But something in Boone's alcohol-clouded mind had crystallized into terrible clarity. I know what really killed those cattle, Pryor, and it wasn't witchcraft. The flames were climbing higher now, singing the hem of Clementine's dress. Sweat beaded on her forehead from the growing heat. Please, she whispered, then louder. Someone please listen to him. The ravings of a drunk, Pryor declared, but his voice carried a slight tremor. Continue with the execution. Boone took a staggering step forward, his revolver still drawn but pointed skyward. Then explain why I saw you dumping barrels into Willow Creek 3 nights ago, right upstream from where the cattle drink. A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the crowd. Several people exchanged worried glances. From the gathered townspeople, Bertie Sloan stepped forward. At 73, she was the town's unofficial keeper of memory and conscience. I'd lived here my whole life, she said, her weathered voice carrying the weight of authority. And I've never seen anything like what's been happening to our animals. She fixed Pryor with a steady stare. Maybe we should listen. The flames had reached Clementine's dress now. She could feel them scorching her legs through the fabric, and she pressed herself as far back against the post as possible. He kept me locked in that cellar, she called out desperately. 2 days without food or water. I was delirious when he brought me that paper to sign. More faces in the crowd showed doubt now. The torchbearers hesitated instead of advancing. Cut her. Loose Pryor, Boone demanded, swaying but determined. Before you do something you can't undo. Never, the Reverend snarled, gesturing sharply to his men. Finish this. But as the guards moved toward Boone, Bertie Sloan was already slipping away from the crowd, remembering something crucial about those barrels, something that would unravel everything Reverend Pryor had built. The next few minutes dissolved into chaos. Boone struggled with the guards while keeping his gun away from innocent bystanders. The crowd scattered and surged unpredictably. And through it all, the flames continued their relentless climb up Clementine's dress. She managed to work one hand partially free, frantically trying to beat down the fire while smoke filled her lungs. The pain was becoming unbearable and black. Spots danced at the edges of her vision. That's when Bertie returned, dragging a wooden barrel across the dirt. The elderly woman's face was grim with purpose as she tilted it toward the crowd, revealing thick, oily liquid that gave off a sharp, chemical odor. "I found this behind the church," Bertie announced, her voice cutting through the noise, "along with 6 others just like it. All empty, and all reeking of the same poison that's been killing our cattle." Pryor's face went white as fresh snow. For the first time since this ordeal began, he seemed to have lost control. But Clementine was running out of time. The flames had spread up her dress, and she could feel her skin blistering. Her partially freed hand clawed desperately at the ropes. Then Nolan Graves burst from the shadows between 2 buildings, carrying a bucket of water. The crowd gasped as the man who had abandoned his bride suddenly appeared, splashing the contents across the flames at her feet. Steam hissed upward as the fire retreated. "Forgive me," he whispered as he sawed at her bonds with a knife. "I was a coward." Clementine looked into his face, really looked at him for the first time in months. She saw fear there, yes, but also shame and a desperate need for redemption. "Just get me loose," she said as the last rope parted. Pryor made his final desperate gambit. "That barrel proves nothing," he declared. "This is clearly a conspiracy to protect the witch." But Boone, his brief moment of clarity fading as alcohol reasserted its hold, managed one more crucial revelation. "Tell them about the mining company, Pryor," he slurred. "Tell them why you really needed to poison the creek." "Mining company?" Bertie's eyes narrowed. "What mining company?" Pryor's hands trembled as his carefully constructed facade crumbled. "There is no mining company. This drunk is hallucinating." Clementine, now free from the stake but with her dress still smoldering, stepped forward. Her green eyes blazed with fury as she faced her accuser. "Tell them the truth, Judson," she said, using his first name with deliberate disrespect. "Tell them about the silver deposits you found under the creek bed. Tell them how you needed the cattle dead so people would sell their land cheap." The Reverend's mask finally fell away completely. But as the town began to turn against him, none of them noticed the 3 horsemen who had just ridden into town Pryor's business partners, who had no intention of letting their profitable scheme be exposed. The leader of the 3 newcomers dismounted slowly, his scarred face surveying the chaos with calculating eyes. His name was Marcus Kane, and he'd killed men for far less than what this situation might cost him. "Reverend Pryor," he called out in a voice like gravel, "seems you've got a problem." Pryor's relief was visible. "Thank God you're here, Mr. Kane. The situation has gotten completely out of hand." But the townspeople were no longer the frightened sheep they'd been an hour ago. The poison barrel, Clementine's accusations, and now the arrival of armed strangers had awakened something in them, a realization that they'd been played for fools. Boone squinted at the newcomers through bloodshot eyes. "I know you," he said, his words slurring. "You're the one buying up land downstream." Kane's hand moved closer to his gun. "Old drunk doesn't know what he's talking about." "Maybe he does," Bertie said, still clutching the poison barrel. "Maybe that's why you needed those cattle dead, so folks would sell cheap to your mining operation." The tension in the square grew thick. Several townsmen had begun reaching for their own weapons, finally understanding the scope of the conspiracy that had nearly claimed an innocent life. Kane smiled coldly. The girl was legally condemned. The execution should proceed. Like hell it will, Nolan said, pulling Clementine protectively closer. His earlier cowardice had been replaced by fierce determination. But what none of them had noticed was that Boone, despite his drunken state, had quietly circled around behind the mounted gunman. Years of cavalry experience were slowly surfacing through the whiskey fog, and he just spotted the tactical advantage he needed. The confrontation that followed would be swift and decisive. When the smoke cleared, Kane and his men were in custody along with Reverend Pryor. The contracts found in their saddlebags provided all the evidence needed to ensure justice would be served, but it was the transformation of the people themselves that proved most lasting. A community that had been willing to burn one of their own based on lies had rediscovered the courage to stand up for truth. Boone Delaney, the town drunk who'd become an unlikely hero, pinned on a sheriff's badge that afternoon and began the hard work of rebuilding both his life and the community's trust. Clementine Cross walked free, her name cleared and her faith in justice restored, though she would carry the scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of her life. And Nolan Graves learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right. Despite being afraid in the end, Perdition lived up to its name, not as a place of damnation, but as a community that had faced its own capacity for evil and chosen redemption instead. Epilogue. 6 months later, the scars on Clementine's legs had faded to thin white lines, barely visible beneath her new blue dress. She stood at the window of the schoolhouse, watching children play in the yard where the execution stake had once stood. The town had torn it down the day after the trial, using the wood to build new benches for the church, a different church, with a different preacher who spoke of forgiveness rather than damnation. How are they doing today? Dr. Margaret Chen asked, entering the classroom with her medical bag. The Chinese-American physician had arrived in Perdition 3 months ago, drawn by word that the town was rebuilding itself and in need of healing, both physical and spiritual. Better, Clementine said, gesturing toward the children. Little Sarah Mills actually smiled at me yesterday. First time since ... double quote. She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what she meant. Dr. Chun set down her bag and joined Clementine at the window. Healing takes time, for communities as well as individuals. Through the glass, they could see Sheriff Boone Delaney making his afternoon rounds. His step was steady now, his uniform pressed and clean. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight as he stopped to help old Mr. Peterson with a heavy sack of grain. The transformation from town drunk to respected lawman hadn't been easy. There were still nights when the bottle called to him, but he'd found something stronger to hold on to. Miss Cross? A small voice interrupted her thoughts. Emma Rodriguez, barely 6 years old, stood in the doorway holding a handful of wildflowers. These are for you. Mama said you like yellow ones. Clementine knelt down to accept the bouquet, her heart swelling. Emma's family had been among the loudest voices calling for her execution 6 months ago. Now the child brought her flowers. They're beautiful, Emma. Thank you. As the little girl skipped back to her desk, Dr. Chun smiled. You've done something remarkable here, you know. Not many people could forgive what this town did to you. Clementine turned the flowers in her hands, breathing in their sweet scent. I had to choose, she said quietly. Carry hatred or help heal. I couldn't do both. The door opened again, and Nolan Graves entered carrying a stack of new books donated by the territorial government. His left shoulder still showed a slight stiffness from where Pryor's bullet had found its mark, but he wore the injury without complaint, a reminder of the moment he'd chosen courage over cowardice. Good afternoon, ladies, he said, setting the books on Clementine's desk. His eyes met hers briefly, and she saw the question there that he asked without words every day. Have you forgiven me yet? Her answer was always the same gentle smile that said, I'm working on it. We both are. Their relationship had changed since that terrible day. The easy intimacy they'd once shared was gone, replaced by something more cautious, but perhaps more honest. They were learning each other again, building trust on a foundation of shared trauma and mutual redemption. Any word from the territorial capital? Dr. Chun asked. Nolan nodded. The mining company's assets have been seized and will be distributed to the families who lost livestock. Pryor and his associates will likely spend the rest of their lives in prison. He paused, then added quietly, Justice was served, but I don't think any of us feel like celebrating. Through the window, they could see Bertie Sloan tending her garden behind the general store. At 73, she'd become the town's unofficial keeper of memory, ensuring that the story of what had happened would be told truthfully, so that such darkness might never take root in perdition again. The afternoon sun slanted through the classroom windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the warm air. Children's laughter echoed from the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, not Pryor's church, which had been torn down and the ground given to the town for a new park, but the simple wooden chapel the community had built together with their own hands. Clementine arranged Emma's flowers in a small vase on her desk and returned to preparing lessons for the next day. She was teaching the children about the Constitution, about rights that couldn't be taken away by fear or superstition, about the importance of standing up for truth, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult, as the sun set over perdition, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The town settled into evening routine. Children helped with chores. Families gathered for supper. Sheriff Delaney locked up his office and walked home to the small house he'd bought with his first honest wages in years. And in the schoolhouse, Clementine Cross finished her lesson plans and blew out the lamp. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose healing over hatred, hope over despair. She stepped outside and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere among them, she liked to think, were the souls of all those who had suffered injustice but had not lived to see redemption. She whispered a prayer for them, and for herself, and for the community that had learned to be better than its worst impulses. The burning was over. The healing had begun, and in a town called Perdition, that was miracle enough. Years later, when travelers would ask about the schoolmom with the gentle smile and the steady sheriff who never touched a drop, the old-timers would tell them about the day their town almost lost its soul. They'd speak of how close they'd come to becoming the very evil they thought they were fighting, and how 3 unlikely heroes, a falsely accused woman, a broken-down drunk, and a coward who found his courage, had saved them all from themselves. They'd tell of barrels filled with poison, of silver buried beneath creek beds, and of a preacher who'd forgotten that his calling was to love, not condemn. But most of all, they'd speak of redemption, how a community that had been willing to burn an innocent woman alive had learned to choose mercy over vengeance, truth over comfortable lies. The execution stake was gone, replaced by a small memorial garden where yellow wildflowers bloomed each spring. Carved into a simple stone marker were words that Clementine Cross herself had chosen, in memory of all who have suffered injustice, and in hope that we may always have the courage to choose what is right over what is easy. And beneath those words, in smaller script, a reminder that would endure long after the last witness to that terrible day had passed from this world. The price of justice is eternal vigilance, not against our neighbors, but against the darkness in our own hearts. This is how Perdition earned its redemption, not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through the quiet daily choice to be better than they had been, to see clearly, to stand for truth, to protect the innocent. To Never forget. The end.